today. All right, greetings, everyone. Welcome back to those of you who were with us for the first panel. We were off to an intense start, and we now move to our second panel, which I think will probably discuss some of the issues we couldn't resist discussing already in the first panel. So we have broached a little, but we really wanted to have this a second panel on diversity and the democratization of academic freedom, the extent to which meanings of academic freedom are being reinvented in an age where students and others are increasingly involved in that redefinition. So without more ado, Angela Campbell, colleague from a faculty of law at McGill University, but has also worked at the Provost's office for several years now around some of these issues, has given us the pleasure of chairing this panel. Angela?
Hey, thanks, Fred. So hi, everybody. As Fred said, I'm Angela Campbell, and I'm a professor in the Faculty of Law at McGill, and I also have an appointment at the moment as Associate Provost for Equity and Academic Policies at McGill, and I'm delighted to be the session's moderator and to introduce our panelists and the themes that we're going to get to explore over the next 90 minutes together. And I'm actually really happy here to see so many familiar faces and friends on this call. So hello to everybody all over the world. So I'm not going to read the bios of the esteemed panelists because this is all set out in the program. So I'll just highlight a few key salient points related to them and the topics that they'll cover. And then I'll also present three questions that I hope we can explore together this morning, just as a launching pad for discussion. So our first panelist is Dr. Sijbolt Noorda, the chair of the governing body of the Observatory, Magna, Charta, Universitatum, and president emeritus of the University of Amsterdam. He's also the past president of the Association of Dutch Research Universities and a former board member of the European University Association. Dr. Noorda's paper is entitled Academic Freedom, More Than a Motto. This work promises to explore the notion of community and relationship, both within the academy and between the academy and wider society, determining how the promotion of academic freedom can be deployed to meet the challenge of building and sustaining social connection and social advancement, both locally and globally. So we look forward to discussing that. Professor Kwadwo Appiagyei-Atua is an associate professor and senior lecturer at the School of Law of the University of Ghana, and he will be our second presenter. He's an expert in public international law and international human rights law, and his paper is entitled Diversity, Decolonization, and Democratization of Academic Freedom in Africa. This work will provide a critical reflection on the way in which academic freedom has been understood and marshaled or not within the context of African higher education institutions, focusing on the independence of the institution rather than solely on the freedoms of individuals, researchers that is, within universities. Professor Appiagyei-Atua's contribution will invite us to reflect on the risks inherent to political and state interference with research and teaching. And I look forward to hearing also about how political interference stands to compromise the freedom to learn that should belong to students. So often we're thinking about academic freedom on the part of the scholarly members of the university community. And I think that this paper will invite us to think about the scholarly freedoms or the freedom to learn that belongs to our students. And our third and final presenter, who I don't know whether he's here yet, but is Murtaza Shaikh. He will be our last presenter, and I know he might be a couple of minutes late, but he's the policy lead at Ofcom and the advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues, where he's working to develop effective guidelines on hate speech, social media, and he's here. Good morning. Or good morning for me, and minorities. Dr. Shaikh specializes in online hate speech, minority rights, and social media content regulation and moderation. His experience and expertise will allow us to explore where and how to trace the line between free speech and free expression on the one hand, and hateful speech, hateful expression on the other. We look forward to hearing about how government and academic institutions can and should protect minority groups from hateful speech, especially when this stands to incite violent conduct, while at the same time championing individual rights to offer a wide berth of protection to speech, thought, and expression. So before launching into individual presentations, I thought I would suggest 3 themes that came to my mind as axes that cut across each of these presenters' papers as I read their abstract. And I tried to tie these themes to the topic of the panel, which is diversity and democratization of academic freedom. So the 3 questions, and again, they're just points for elaboration that we might jump upon either in the presentations, but also in the conversation that we have in plenary that follows. So first, in the North American context at least, 2 arguments are flourishing today. First is that academic freedom and free expression are under threat by the far left. A second argument is that academic freedom is weaponized by those who already wield influence to maintain their stronghold on power and to sustain various forms of social oppression. So these views are polarized, of course, but they invoke academic freedom to advance a political viewpoint. And this is actually quite, renders our campus communities often quite divisive and does not lend itself to healthy engagement and dialogue. So to what extent does the work that you're each pursuing engage with this debate, and how is it reconciled in the context in which you pursue your work? Or perhaps in your view, these points of view are just not reconcilable. The second question that I would ask is the following. So academic freedom is a concept that folds neatly within broader Western liberal political ideologies, and that's less true for the concept of academic responsibility. So to what extent do you see the notion of responsibility as the necessary corollary to academic freedom in the context in which you pursue your scholarship? And the third is related to my own work at McGill. So at McGill, I oversee the portfolio that's today called EDI, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And in conversations with underrepresented groups, which I do all the time, and particularly with respect to racialized and gender minorities, I hear the following argument. So what I'm told is that academic freedom is antithetical to the needs of people who have been oppressed and continue to be oppressed in Western universities. It is antithetical to justice outcomes for them. So academic freedom does not protect or advance the interests of people who are underrepresented and continue to face social oppressions. In their view, academic freedom does not serve them. How do you respond to that view? And more broadly, is it possible for academic freedom and equity and diversity and inclusion goals to be simultaneously pursued? So there's just some food for thought. And I think with that, I'll begin by turning it over first to Dr. Noorda.
Thank you very much, both for the invitation and for this valuable introduction. I have been listening in the first part of the conference earlier this morning, and we have already rediscovered that academic freedom is a very wide landscape with many hills and valleys and very many different sites. And it being such a wide landscape, there is of course an unavoidable practice of highlighting, either trying to highlight everything or having to select. You can talk about the legal side of the matter. You can talk about the relationship of academic freedom to related rights or duties like human rights and all sorts of other rights. You can talk about the historical perspective. I've myself always been very interested in the history of universities to in a way check the tendency of universities to be triumphal and heroic about their past. Well, there's no reason to do that. If you study the history of universities from the point of view of autonomy and academic freedom, there are many more examples of obedience and of universities being in control than of universities being heralds of freedom and standing up to oppression and being agent of change and innovation. But I won't talk about the legal issues nor about the rights issues, not about the history. I will concentrate on one particular perspective, and that's the perspective of the university as a social institution and as a community of academics and students. And I do this because I am the present chair of the Magna Carta Observatory in Bologna, Italy. And our basis was a statement on the main foundational privileges and rights of the universities in 1988. And we have just last year completed the drafting of a fresh version of that foundation statement of the Magna Carta Universitatum. This is a declaration that universities subscribe to as institutions, that they commit themselves to, and that they promise not just to underwrite, but also to live in their actual practice. And next week, we will see the formal launch in a remote conference of this new statement. And the commitment under the chapter of academic freedom of this new draft statement that is going to be launched next week reads, universities are non-discriminatory spaces of tolerance and respect, where diversity of perspectives flourishes and where inclusivity anchored in principles of equity and fairness prevails. Universities therefore commit themselves to advance equity and fairness in all aspects of academic life, including admissions, hiring, and promotion practices. While in the earlier statement of 1988, it was a very short sentence about academic freedom as a compass for campus life, we have now included a couple of aspects that seem to be urgently relevant in our day and age. I will, however, not talk about these words and this statement. My contribution is titled Academic Freedom More Than a Motto. And what I mean by that is that academic freedom, like all freedoms, remains just a word and just a concept if you don't practice it. I recall in the first part of this session, Professor McGill making the statement that being practical about academic freedom is very, very important and essential. And my thesis will be that universities as social institutions and as academic communities should indeed be much more active in discussing and in developing joint values on academic freedoms themselves, and not just do what they usually do, that is respond when something happens, when there is a crisis, when universities are under attack. You see many universities developing a sort of 5 minutes course to academic freedom once they have to defend themselves, either towards politics or in the media or among colleagues. And my first suggestion would be that living up to this commitment that I just quoted, universities should realize what kind of an institution they are and which position they have in society, what their profile is. They should realize that their self-image is not always the same as the image they have in society. Many in society look upon universities as self-serving, very partisan institutions that are living in their own bubble and that are making rights and privileges to protect that bubble and those rights. And in some countries and in some cases, they are labeled elitist communities, mainly serving their own peers. Well, if that is the case, universities should not start talk about academic freedom by talking about academic freedom, but they should, before they do that, talk about and make clear what kind of an institution they want to be. You cannot have the label of being a self-serving elitist organization and then going on to preach academic freedom and promote diversity if that is not seen to happen. So university's first task, as I see it, would be to really take this challenge seriously. The second challenge is very much linked up to this. The contemporary university is not usually a sort of a cohesive community at all. It is more like a kashba with a host of individual shopkeepers, or it is a sports ground for individual career competition, rather than a collaborative community with shared ideals and values. And in the last decades, this tendency has become even stronger in many places. The shared values, joint community side of the university that was very much under discussion in my part of the world in Western Europe in the 70s, is all but gone. And universities are seen as indeed more like a sports ground for individual careers. And most people in the university are by far more interested in those individual careers and their progress than in these joint responsibilities. And again, only when something bad happens, when there is a crisis or a specific case, they start to realize there is this value base of the university. Terence was saying in the earlier part of the meeting that most academics, according to a survey that he and his colleagues made of European universities recently, do not even know about these values. I completely agree. I mean, as a point in case, the research universities of the Netherlands have issued a new code for good governance for their universities only a year ago. And strangely enough, the term academic freedom doesn't even once occur in that code. There's a lot of talk about professional ethics and academic integrity and fairness, but academic freedom as a concept is not even mentioned, let alone the defense of it and the need to unite as an academic community on it. So my second point is we have to work on that to reinstall that sense of community. Otherwise, the university will be very vulnerable when it comes to protection and practicing of academic freedom, and for that matter, institutional autonomy. My final point, and the last one, is in my way of seeing equally important. Freedoms never ever exist just for themselves. Freedoms are freedoms for a purpose. And one should ask why academic freedom is so crucial to universities, to academic life. And the first answer would be that history and experience in academia shows that without freedom, the progress of science, the development of scholarship, both in terms of method, in terms of topics, but also in terms of views and perspectives, is frozen, and it doesn't develop. The university will not make progress when it's not free in terms of scholarship. There is, however, a very important second purpose that academic freedom should serve, and that's the crucial connection between academy and society. Universities are not standalone institutions apart from the world. They are not there for themselves and to serve themselves, not the individual researcher, not the individual institution, not its donors, not its leadership. They are there for the progress and development of society, both their own local communities, the national communities, and a human society on our planet, and even the conservation and protection of the planet as our habitat. Those social purposes, again, are not social purposes that in my book should be left to individual students or academics to decide upon. The university should be an arena where we discuss those matters and where we see to which extent and in what way we as an academic community can contribute to the well-being and development of our societies, both at the local and as the global level. It's these three pleas for the emphasize the new emphasis on community and the value-based community that academia should be, and its purpose for society, its responsibility. That is the core of my contribution today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. That was excellent. Thank you so much. I'll turn it over to Professor Appiagyei-Atua.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. So the topic of my presentation is diversity, decolonization, and democratization of academic freedom. I'll begin by making some general observations or sort of theoretical framework which will be used to then link up to some practical examples and historical realities in order to come to the conclusion that where students' rights are not respected, it affects the project of decolonizing the classroom and promoting democracy within a larger society. So in the first place, I identify 4 pillars of academic freedom. That is institutional autonomy, self-governance, freedom for academics and students, and tenure for academics. And within the framework of the stakeholders in the academic freedom matrix, identify the society as the space where governments and the university are located. And within the university, that is the academic community, we have the university itself as part of the academic community, academics and students. And the government, the university, academics and students, each has a relationship with one another, with the government being the principal duty bearer and the university, and therefore owing duties to the university, to the academics and to students. The university also is a rights holder, but also is a duty bearer to academics and students. Academics also are rights holders to the university and to the government, as well as a duty bearer to students. So relying on the notion that these pillars that I've mentioned and the stakeholders, their rights and duties are, in the context of the academic freedom matrix, are indivisible, interrelated and interdependent. And I also make the claim that academic freedom is a functional necessity, as Sijbolt just said. It's not just for the good of the academic or the students, but it is for the general good of the society if it is properly, the duties inherent in that is properly performed. So at the end of the day, the research that is done, the new knowledge that is acquired is used to promote the well-being of the university. Therefore, where a particular stakeholder's rights are ignored, it affects the other entities, their ability to enjoy their rights and to perform their functions. And for that matter, the society becomes the loser at the end of the day. So with this as a background, I then want to link up the discussion to the values of democracy and its link with academic freedom. So without democracy, academic freedom is compromised. And I will give out some statistics to support that within the African context. So there's a relationship between democracy and academic freedom. And then without democratizing academic freedom, certain members of the academic community will be denied the opportunity to exercise the academic freedom. So it means that democratization is not only within the larger society where the government would seek out to respect or involve the people in decision making, but also within the university space. Academic freedom, which is at the center of university education, should be democratized among the three main stakeholders who form the academic community. That is the university, represented by university management, academics, and students. So where that democratization doesn't take place within the university environment, then we have a situation where the ability of one of these actors to enjoy the academic freedom and to use it for the greater good of the society is compromised. And so that interdependence and indivisibility will come into play, and then it will show that in the end, while it will affect the individual stakeholder, it generally affects the entire university community and by extension the society as a whole. And then when this human rights is also democratized, or academic freedom is democratized, it will help in the development of democracy in the larger society. So in the end, the society will suffer if academic freedom is not democratized within the university space, particularly when it affects the rights of academics as well as students. But in this presentation, the focus is more on students. So historically, colonial university education was not something that the colonialists tried to promote within Africa. So at the time of independence, around the early 60s, there were only 18 universities across the whole of Africa. But these 18 or so universities remained colonized. While we had political independence, these universities remained colonized in at least two respects, in terms of staff and in terms of curriculum. So there's this whole concept of where we see academic freedom being championed within these 18 institutions by the former colonial authorities for different reasons. One is that the curriculum favors the colonial policies that they had, which was to train Europeanized elites to maintain, after colonialism, the political economic framework that was put in place to promote the colonial enterprise. And then the staff were also because the university education didn't start early in Africa. There were not a lot of people who had acquired that higher university education to teach within the universities. So the majority of them were foreigners. In the case of Ghana, about 66 to 70% at the time of independence, the staff were mainly British. Okay, but within that context, African states adopted the notion of promoting academic freedom. And our first president, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, for example, is noted as saying that the objectives of a university cannot be achieved without scrupulous respect for academic freedom. So, but the whole thing is that we have three generations of constitution making in Africa, which should be put into context to better understand the discussion on academic freedom. The first generation constitutions were those that were developed by the colonial authorities, which was negotiated for, and which therefore captured liberal ideas of democracy and respect for human rights, including academic freedom. But immediately after independence, African states began to jettison this kind of democracy constitutions and move away from liberal democracy to the one-party system, where African socialism became the slogan and then the mantra that states began to adopt. So one-party state became the norm. All people should belong to the one party. There is no dissent. And therefore, it became incongruous, some kind of an unfit arrangement where the university has its autonomy, has its freedom, and has the ability to criticize government. So government saw that the university, apart from the fact that in reality, it was suffering from the colonial heritage still embedded in the university space, the government also saw the university as a challenge to the authority of the government and not in line with the one-party ideology. So, and at the same time, the third element is that African states were in a rush to promote development because the idea was that we needed to catch up with the rest of the world as a result of colonialism, slavery, and so on. So the university is to be part of this development machinery, which led to the development of the notion of developmental universities in Africa. And this was cemented and endorsed in the 1962 UNESCO Conference on the Development of Higher Education in Africa in Tananarive in Madagascar. So with that as the background, African leaders had no choice than to capture university management. So you have a situation where the president is a chancellor, the minister is the chairman of or chair of council, the vice president, the VC or the vice chancellor is appointed from the office of the president. Council members are government appointees and so on. So the structure at the top, that's the university management, is absolutely controlled by the governmental machinery. And that was a pattern that was repeated in the new universities that were set up after independence. And so I want to quote from the first Ghanaian vice president of the University of Ghana, who certainly was concerned about this situation. And this, for the sake of time, I'll just skip that and indicate that as a result of this situation, things didn't go well with academic freedom during the second generation making period when African socialism came into place. The third generation of constitution making in Africa was after the fall of the Berlin Wall. New democracies emerged, human rights returned, academic freedom returned, and for the first time, within constitutions of about a quarter of African states, specific reference was made to academic freedom. And in about 13% of the cases, indirect references to academic freedom. So that meant a retreat of the political elite from the university management space. However, they didn't actually retreat, but they set up proxies within the university management system to do their bidding. And so there was this continuation of the neglect of academic freedom. And mind you, the decolonization project stopped because of the fact that academic freedom was absent, and therefore academics couldn't be involved in that project. And then students were also sidelined. And so it became a sort of political tool that governments would just play along with and claim to be doing it, but in reality, it wasn't the case. Now, at the end of the day, students also became subjected to the dictates of academics who saw the students as a means that they can also exert some pressure on to be able to at least enjoy some benefits within the university space. So generally, academic freedom for students became a byproduct of the protection of the freedoms of academics. Consequently, the classroom and the curriculum in most African countries remain colonized. Okay, and so the whole idea of the classroom and the curriculum becomes important when we talk about decolonizing the classroom and decolonizing the curriculum. The curriculum or the classroom is a space for students and academics to use their agency to reflect and challenge orthodoxy and to invent new knowledge and to act on controversial matters. It is also a space to gain greater epistemological access, as well as to empower students and involve them in the decolonization projects. For curriculum, as Petro Dupreis puts it, says it's not limited to what is written on paper, but extends to what we teach and do not teach for whatever reason, how we teach and why we teach in particular ways. So the question then was, how do we involve students in these projects? Some African scholars came together to come up with the Kampala Declaration on Intellectual Freedom and Social Responsibility. And even though not much space was given to students, there was this particular Article 7, which is interesting to note that it called for the rights of students to initiate, participate in, and determine academic programs of their institutions in accordance with the highest standards of education. So that is the space that was given to students to help decolonize the classroom. And what do we mean by decolonization in this context? It wasn't just one scholar talks about two types of colonialism, the first generation and second generation. The first is the physical colonization that took place, and second is colonization of the mind. And these two generations led to the denigration and decimation of indigenous knowledges, which gave rise to epistemic injustices. And so decolonization is a project that is aimed at ensuring that higher education will respond to inequalities and injustices from the past, which has remained in the present, to challenge the dominance of Western knowledge, pedagogy, and research, which dominates the literature, the academic space in Africa, and then also question the colonial roots of university practices and curricula. I think that is the mission that lies ahead of African universities, and which should recognize the role of students, because the classroom is the space that students can use to collaborate with academics, to be able to understand the nature of the colonized space that remains and how it can be decolonized, deconstructed, and reconstructed. And decolonization of the curriculum and the classroom doesn't mean completely overlooking Western knowledge and ideas, but it's just calling for a balance in the knowledge sharing space, and for African peoples to be able to understand the colonial roots and how that impacts on education. So I, for once, if I'm teaching public international law, human rights law, which are my areas of interest, I always try to bring out the fact that European literature on every aspect of course or knowledge area, the Europeans will say that this is a European idea. Europeans brought it first. The same with international law, international human rights, public relations, and so on. But when we're able to bring in the African perspective, it enriches the discourse and people get to understand what is really at stake. And so decolonization of the classroom and curriculum is fundamentally key. It started in South Africa for South African universities, but it has not caught up very well with the rest of Africa. And I think that this is a time and space that it is up to African scholars to actually decolonize the classroom and share that space with students to be able to promote academic freedom, and therefore to ensure that it helps in ensuring that the classroom becomes decolonized, which has the effect of promoting democracy in a larger society. Because the same Kampala Declaration I was talking about sees the role of the academic as not limited to the classroom, but using that advantage or privilege that the academic has on the university space to go and to town and mix gown with town and ensure that they're able to promote human rights and democracy within the larger society. And I think what they miss out is the role that students can also play. Because if students, democratization of academic freedom doesn't take place within the university space, students leave the campus with a questionable and caricatured understanding of democracy. And that is what they take to the larger society, whether at the workplace or when they are going to actual politics. And therefore, the contention is that if the university space is democratized and academic freedom is respected, it would enable decolonization and also enable democratization within the larger society. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we'll turn it now to Dr. Shaikh.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You can hear me, yes? Brilliant. Very honored to be in the company of all of you and such esteemed co-panelists. I'll be approaching this from a different perspective, hopefully a constructive one, and from a different angle. Obviously, I specialize in international human rights law, and in particular, hate speech or incitement to hatred and minorities. So academic freedom isn't my sort of specialism from the beginning. However, I've approached this topic from the perspective of a case study. And that case study is, in fact, a university in Canada, which I won't name, but it's important to say that so that there is some context to the case study and what I'll be talking about in relation to the analysis or the conclusions from that. And the case study is basically to do with the university and about how structural discrimination or historical discrimination can result in a situation where academic freedom is trampled upon and used as a scapegoat. And the flashpoint at which that occurs is when, in an academic setting, so a lecturer to their students decides or attempts to discuss difficult topics, in particular related to racism or racist terminology, and where that is taken by the students to be racist or insensitive, and how that results in the academic in question being sanctioned, and how we arrive at this situation where it appears as though on the face of it that we have to choose between academic freedom and being anti-racist, and really that's not a choice that anyone should have to make, and it would be useful to apply an international human rights framework to this problem, and also to dig a bit deeper and to find out, you know, what lies behind this, and if there are any solutions to this problem, because I think all of us will agree that's not a choice that anyone should have to make. So in relation to a human rights approach to this problem, and to look at it in a quite a legalistic way, and then I'll sort of expand into looking at the broader structural issues that exist at this university that I'm talking about, and probably other Western universities as well. So I'll begin by saying that, you know, what is the relationship between freedom of expression and academic freedom? And I think it's widely agreed that academic freedom is a particularly important subset of freedom of expression. And if freedom of expression is so vital to other fundamental rights and democratic governance, then it could be argued that academic freedom plays even a more critical and acute role in ensuring that democratic governance and the guarantee of other human rights. Now, it's also acknowledged that there may be a wider freedom of expression for certain groups dependent on their particular role in democracy, and academics are not the only ones. It could be applied to parliamentarians, it could be applied to journalists. In particular, you know, if the manifestation of their freedom of expression has a certain democratic aim, then they should be given a wider berth. However, this concept is often misunderstood because it raises the question: do such actors or such categories have unlimited freedom of expression? And I think most popularly this issue came up in the context of Donald Trump and his banning from Facebook, and how Facebook and the newly established oversight board, which looked into this case, had to deal with the issue of should political actors on social media have a greater level of leeway before their content is considered to be hate speech and banned. And I think the simple answer to this from a human rights perspective, and this applies to academics and it applies to political actors and journalists, is that yes, there is a wider berth for freedom of expression. However, that wider berth has to be related to the purpose and function of the expression itself and the role. So if a politician is expressing something controversial that is of a political nature, then that qualifies. But if a politician is inciting hatred or violence or genocide, which is not to do with their political function, then that clearly should not enjoy any greater level of protection. And I would argue the same for an academic. If an academic is talking to a class about something which fits into what they're teaching about and has an overall educative and societal purpose, then clearly they enjoy a wider freedom of expression in relation to that. And when they are talking about things which are not related to their academic function. Like if they insult or are racist towards a student because they're angry, then I don't see how that would enjoy a wider berth or a wider scope for protection on the basis of freedom of expression. So I just wanted to give a brief quote actually from David Kay, who was the former special rapporteur, UN special rapporteur on freedom of expression. And I think it was his final report before he left that position, in which he focused on academic freedom. And he talked about the intersection between academic freedom and freedom of expression, as he elaborated it as the freedom of individuals as members of academic communities, for example, faculty, students, staff, scholars, administrators, community participants, or in their own pursuits, to conduct activities involving the discovery and transmission of information and ideas, and to do so with the full protection of human rights law. The Human Rights Committee of the UN, which oversees the enforcement or implementation of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, has confirmed that freedom of expression involves every form of idea and opinion capable of transmission to others, including teaching, political discourse, and journalism. So, you know, there is not much debate about that fact, that academic freedom falls squarely within, you know, what we consider to be freedom of expression. So, in the context where academic may refer to a racist symbol, term, or word, and where students take offense to that, and students may be directly affected by that if it's referring to a racial or religious or ethnic group, and that student considers themselves to be part of that group, then what should be done in that situation? Or is there a situation where the insensitivity, the sensitivities of certain students, and the gravity or the severity of the racist terminology being referred to calls for a situation where such expression a priori should not be allowed by the university, but also in compliance with human rights law? And that's a difficult question to answer. And if we were to conceptually say where this kind of situation has arisen, we could give the example of Germany, where the presentation or the display of the swastika is not allowed. However, even in that quite severe situation, there is an exemption if it is for artistic or for educational purposes. And if we apply the human rights framework to such expressions, then we know that we would have to apply a three-part test to whether, you know, a permissible limitation can be applied to freedom of expression under international human rights law. And those three parts, for those who don't know, are legality. So in the context of university, it wouldn't be law per se, but university policy. Is there a clear university policy which talks about the use of racist terms, and is that contextualized for the student body? Legitimacy, which is to do with the aim of that policy, and the most important, which is necessity and proportionality. And then there's also the connected principle in the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which talks about the prohibition or the requirement to prohibit the dissemination of ideas of racial superiority and hatred. And basically what happened in this situation was that the lecturer in question was disciplined, was suspended, and the context of their use of the racist term, in this case the N-word, was that they were discussing how certain words, depending on cultural shifts, can change in their connotation, and can go from being derogatory to being empowering. And I think the context of using the N-word in that cultural, artistic context was how it can be used by, for example, rappers in an empowering way, and by others in a racist way. And I think the objection that was raised there was, well, you know, if the N-word is referred to, then should it only be someone who is black who gets to do that in an empowering way? And if someone who is not black refers to it for educational purposes, then what should be done about that? And I think, you know, on a deeper analysis of applying human rights law to this situation, the conclusion was that freedom of expression, in particular academic freedom, quite clearly allows for reference to racist terminology or other racist terms for educational purposes, as long as it does not constitute dissemination. And for it to constitute dissemination, the academic in question would have to be trying to promote that view, would have to be trying to say that they believe in it, and trying to propagate that view, rather than referring to it for educational purposes, and most importantly, in a negative way, to draw attention to the fact that it is something that is not acceptable when used in an offensive attack, attacking or a hateful manner. Now, in this situation, either way, there is a negative outcome. If academic trample is, if academic freedom is constrained unnecessarily, there is a negative outcome. If students end up feeling that their concerns about the use of racist terminology is ignored, then that is a negative outcome. So what is the solution, and what is the deeper understanding of this sort of dynamic that may be replicated at other Western universities? And I believe the answer is that what's needed is a proactive plan by a number of universities, if not all universities, where they try to counter structural discrimination, structural concerns of the student body. And in this particular context, there was actually a buildup of resentment and a feeling of being excluded, and in some cases, even implicit racist behavior. In this particular case, some students were, I think the term is carded, asked for their ID and so on. So there was a perception that they were being profiled and being treated differently from others. But there is also, as others have said, a need to allow students who are from minority or groups that have protected characteristics to actually be involved in the governance of the university, to be involved in the activities of the university, to be consulted in what the curriculum should say, and so on. And if those things are done at a much earlier stage, then we don't get to a point where students' concerns and resentments manifest themselves in a situation where an academic is talking about controversial or issues which are difficult, but nonetheless may require discussion. And just to also to try to conclude, I would say the same instrument which I referred to, which is the International Convention on the Conventional Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which carries this requirement for the prohibition of dissemination of material that may be of racial superiority, also carries in it that the final stage of eliminating racial discrimination is the adoption of measures, particularly in the fields of teaching, education, culture, and information, with a view to combating prejudices which lead to racial discrimination and to promoting understanding, tolerance, and friendship among nations and racial or ethnic groups. And obviously, we've talked about how that can be done in teaching and learning. We've talked about how that can be done in the curriculum. And I would just end by saying that, the lesson from this case study and also just reflecting on human rights law is that it's not enough, really, to say that there is an absence of racism. And I think that applies to an academic context as it does to any other institution, perhaps more so. What needs to happen, there needs to be proactive, positive steps, which actually not just try to eliminate racism, but try to make sure that different racial groups and different ethnic groups and different minority and particular groups feel included and feel part of the governance of universities and feel part of really every aspect of it, not just governance, not just educational, but also social. So there isn't this feeling of being left to the side or being excluded, which can lead to the kind of situation which I've tried to refer to. I think I'll end there. I'm not sure how long that was, but I think it's long enough.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. That gives us a good bit of time for questions. So we've got just over half an hour. And we could open it up, but I thought I would actually circle back to the three members of the panel, perhaps with an invitation to take up one of the questions that I had asked earlier, because I think it actually touches upon all three discussions, which is where and how the notion of responsibility comes into play as the converse of freedom. So thinking about the first presentation and the purpose, so academic freedom existing for a purpose and not kind of having only inherent value, but it is a means to something broader and important, not only for the higher education institutions where it's enjoyed, but also beyond that in relationships with communities and society. And then in regard to the work that is developed by Professor Appiagyei-Atua, the responsibility to ensure that, the responsibility vis-a-vis decolonization, so that it's not something that's done for African institutions, but it's a necessity that that work has to be taken up, and that it has to be left to be taken up so that there can't be interference with those efforts. And then on the final piece, thinking about the classroom context that Dr. Shaikh referred to. So that case study is so well known and shook the academic world in many different ways, and it resulted in broad discussions. And I'll say from my own perspective, what I found personally troubling in the conversation was the focus almost absolutely on rights. So the rights to learn in an environment that's free and clear of harassment and discrimination, which is clear. But then there was this other discussion about the rights to be able to determine how and what one says in their engagement with their students, and also absolute authority over the materials that one chooses to deliver in the classroom. So the conversation moved well beyond the use of a particular word into the realm of the curriculum and the pedagogy. And the focus in the conversations that were taking place across campuses in the country was entirely rights-based and not at all thinking about responsibilities and obligations. So I might just ask the panelists if they've got thoughts on the concept of responsibility in relation to their own or to one another's papers.
Can I respond?
Of course.
Okay. So from my point of view, when you're talking about responsibility, I think we can look at it from two angles. No human right is absolute. And so built into each human right are the concept of limitations. They can be general limitations or specific limitations. And I think in a sense, it constitutes a duty on the rights holder that if you are enjoying these rights, there's a limit to which you can enjoy it so that you don't affect the ability, or the enjoyment of that right doesn't affect the ability of another person to also enjoy his or her rights. Then the other aspect of the duty is what may be specifically imposed by a state in the context of ensuring that the rights that you enjoy should lead to your performing a particular activity or function that may benefit somebody else within the society. And so when you look at it from that angle, within the African human rights concept, that idea of duty is presented there. Of course, the way it is captured and practiced is subject to abuse. But I think that inherent in the whole notion of bringing into the discussion on academic freedom, that responsibility is there, because you want to enjoy your rights in a way that will ensure that you don't go beyond the limits whereby, if, for example, you have the freedom to, within the academic space, to talk about maybe racism, you don't go about and denigrate one race and claim that this is based on academic freedom. So there's a responsibility there. And I think we need to be clear about that so that it is both a negative responsibility and a positive responsibility. Mm-hmm. Negative is not to do anything that will affect the rights of another person. And the positive is actually doing something with what you have as your freedom, as academic freedom, to champion the interests of other people.
I would like to fully subscribe to what Kwadwo just said. I mean, this is these are absolutely essential wisdoms that we should take seriously in university and be following. The real issue occurs when either all of this is being legalized and translated into rights and obligations and things like that, or it becomes something that the community is very much divided upon. When you translate all these things in legal terms in an educational setting, that is paralyzing the whole thing. In my book, education becomes a parody of education. Education and the development of research really needs the kind of experimental freedom where within the usual limits everything goes. And when it is beset by don'ts and do's, this is not going to work. I was having a seminar on academic freedom yesterday with some people from Serbia who are in performance studies in University of Arts, and they said it is absolutely impossible that we develop our abilities as artists and prepare for performances when we are surrounded by do's and don'ts. So that's absolutely killing. But the other side, the divisions within a university, within a school, that's quite a challenge. And I think the only way out is, again, not rules and not do's and don'ts, but engage in debate and try to find common ground. Not common ground of agreement, but common ground of tolerance and respect. Common ground of openness and inclusiveness, and not common ground of uniformity and homogeneity. And that's something that you cannot translate into university rules and regulations by deans and university provosts. That's something that you can only build grassroots way by engaging in debate. And that won't be easy, sometimes painful, but I think that's the only way out.
Thanks. Dr. Shaikh, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, just a couple of points. I think I would echo what the previous speakers have said in relation to rights. I don't think drawing from human rights should be confused with sort of looking at this too legalistically. I think human rights provides an approach, it provides a process, it provides a helpful way of looking at things. And if we're going to be talking about rights in a quite narrow legalistic sense, then that's really not the right, a university or academic institution is not the right place for that to be happening. Because at the end of the day, it is a community and it is a form of family even. So in that environment, it's really about listening. And it's really, so the point I wanted to just come back to in relation to responsibility, I think one of the responsibilities academic institutions have is not just to listen, but to listen to potential perceptions that aggrieved students may have. It's not good enough for you to say, well, the things you're complaining about don't exist, because we can objectively show that. An objective determination of there being no concerns on race, on racism grounds or on diversity grounds or on inclusive grounds is not good enough to get people just to feel better about those things. So we have to listen to perceptions, we have to incorporate them, and we have to do something about them in order to attain a more cohesive university community. And I would also say, in relation to what Professor Noorda said about creating situations where we can encourage debate, I would add to that what I just said, which is that, you know, that if there are forums at which grievances can be aired and listened to, no matter how minor, no matter how, you know, how much we may disagree with them, then the avenues for expressing them will be broader, and more things will come up, rather than in the example I gave where you know, there was a very narrow channel to express those grievances, and it was done so in that way.
Okay, thank you. I have a further follow-up question, but I think I'm not going to take up too much space in that regard. So I might just ask and see if there's questions from the audience. And I see that Dr. Uzma Jamil, my colleague, who's here and has a question. So Uzma.
Thank you to the speakers and to all of you here. I thank you for your talks. I found it very interesting. I have two follow-up questions / comments to Professor Appiagyei-Atua and Dr. Shaikh. So Professor Appiagyei-Atua, in terms of decolonization of the curriculum, so I agree with your argument about how it would work in an African context. I think in a North American context, it brings up a certain tension. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. On one hand, I think decolonization asks us to think about the contingency of knowledge production and the fact that it arises within certain kinds of historical, political, social conditions tied to colonialism. At the same time, this line of argument runs into resistance from people who would argue that knowledge is in fact above and outside the world, that is objective, universal, etc. And so how would you address this this tension? I think I'll just mention the other question too, so that both speakers can address it individually. Second point is around your Professor Dr. Shaikh, you're talking about inclusion and governance. This is more of a comment, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. I think governance, as we all know, even in democratic situations, is made up of structures that are uneven. And so that inclusion then of various groups is also uneven, which then raises competing claims to various kinds of arguments and various kinds of rights. So I'm not sure that this would be worked out better or worse in a university setting than it would in a larger political democratic setting. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts might be on that. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll go first to Dr. Appiagyei-Atua.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think it's a very important one. My response is that, yes, knowledge is universal, and there shouldn't be any limitation to the acquisition of knowledge. But I think also acquisition of knowledge should be contextualized to take into account the particular historical, cultural, and other circumstances of a people. And I think that if we want to, like Lagrange said, there are two types of colonialism. The other part, which is the mental part, the colonization of the mind. I think that is what decolonization is centered on. So you need to define the colony. The colony is the space captured by knowledge that is developed without taking into account the historical circumstances and trying to camouflage it. So a colleague of mine, Professor Mutua, talks about the savages and then the saviors. So you're talking about human rights. Let me use that as an example, where you have horrible records of human rights violations as you have it in slavery, 400 years of slavery, about almost 100 years of colonialism, depending on which parts of the country, of the continent you're talking about. And immediately after the end of the Second World War, these colonial authorities come back and say, hey, we need to help you to enjoy human rights. And this is the kind of human rights you need to enjoy, packaged as a Eurocentric idea and claiming it to be a universalist notion of human rights. Clearly, we see some contradiction there and a hypocrisy here, because you declared the people that you colonized and you put under slavery as being savages. And you now turn around to say that the problem is an internal problem. You are the cause of the problem. We have come to save you. We have come to save you human rights. When natural rights theories talked about the universality of human rights, but people were excluded from their enjoyment. So I think that we need to contextualize the discussion so that we'll be able to properly identify what kind of human rights we're talking about, for example. So I certainly subscribe to the cultural relativist approach to human rights, where you need to say that human rights comes from a particular people's culture. And how do you identify that culture and how best it can be enjoyed within the particular context? And talking about the fact that you are promoting the space for other cultures to be recognized as contributing to the human rights knowledge and discourse, so that you are deconstructing the knowledge base and reconstructing it and giving space for other indigenous knowledges to also be recognized, so that there will be that balance and ability for people to understand their own culture and not remain as strangers of their own culture, and rather prefer to adopt a particular culture that doesn't suit their peculiar culture and circumstances. That is the major problem that the university faces in Africa. So, for example, I made a point in my presentation that deconstruction or decolonization is not against internationalization. The two should go together. But we should talk about smart internationalization, whereby you pick from internationalization and then, where necessary, deconstruct it and make sure that the other element of knowledge is also represented, so that it creates a room where you are not saying you are completely bastardizing one aspect of knowledge and replacing it for another, as is typically the case with early scholars on European ideas on knowledge, basically saying that human rights is an idea of Europe, international law developed from Europe, which is not correct. International relations developed from Europe. Any area of study that I've ventured into, philosophy, African philosophy is not recognized as proper philosophy, and so on. So I think that is what is missing, the missing piece that needs to be recognized, so that there will be that balance, and that is exactly what the discussion is all about. And there are also reference to not just the literature, but who produces the literature. And that is also important, so that if you are developing a curriculum on a subject matter, it is not just 100% or 90% populated by writings from Europe and so on, even though the issue is about a particular problem affecting Africa, and which therefore should reflect the African reality. And that is missing in a lot of the literature. And so that is what we're talking about. There's no mention or no talk of critical race theory in a number of African universities. But critical race theory is not only something that I think should be taught in US and UK. It is something that also needs to be taught in Africa, because the race issue is still here, and we need to lift the veil and properly put it in the proper context of discussing it in such a way that will ensure that we're able to unpack these racial biases, cultural biases, and make sure that we understand from our perspective, and make sure that from that angle, it becomes a meaningful tool to promote development within African context that I think will be sustainable. If you're talking about the issue of people trying to go to Europe to seek greener pastures, it's all about whether we want to accept our own and stay here and work here, or we think that it's only when you are in Europe or America that you can find greener pastures. That's the point I'm making.
Great, thank you. I'll turn to Dr. Shaikh to respond to the second question from Dr. Jamil.
Yeah, I won't take long, but I think the comment was about governance and structures and how they may themselves be unequal and so on. And I think in relation to that, the quick answer is obviously the structures themselves need to be invented and revamped and so on, and they need to be created or tailor-made to the purpose in mind. And we're talking about structures that are going to give a voice and that are going to make certain members of a student body or even from staff feel included in how the university is governed and how it functions and how it delivers different things. But I would argue at many universities, those structures don't yet exist effectively, even to just involve students in the running of a university, let alone students who are, of a minority background or who belong to some other protected characteristic. So I think that is a very, very, thoughtful comment, and that's something that we need to be applying, not just to be including certain minority ethnic students and other protected groups, but also just students generally need to be a greater part of how universities work. It's not good enough for them to be just part of governance that relates to them only. They should really have a greater input into how the university functions, and in particular, how it does things and what it teaches.
Excellent. Thanks so much. I'll go to Fred.
Yeah, just a few quick reactions. I mean, I think this is a really interesting conversation, and it seems to me we're sometimes navigating a fine line between agreeing on the general principles and then, disagreeing on how they might work out in practice and in particular contexts. So maybe I wanted to emphasize some of the kind of not necessarily disagreement, but differences in sensitivity. But first, I think so. I really was convinced by Dr. Shaikh's idea that, I mean, partly, we've had a few flashpoints. The one you mentioned was one, but the whole big question is, what are they a crisis of, right? And so it comes quite naturally to some commentators to say this is a crisis of academic freedom, but quite often that involves a heavy dose of decontextualization, right? The crisis, in fact, is long in the making, and it's a mistake to not analyze them as merely crisis of academic freedom when they're primarily crisis of inclusion and diversity that just sort of manifest themselves at the very last minute through kind of reflexive invocations of academic freedom, right? But we still, I mean, there's still in the media in particular a really strong tendency to focus on sort of the tail end of incidents that were years in the making. And so here I think there's kind of different sensitivities. So I wanted, Professor Noorda, I mean, I wanted to push you a bit on some of your suggestions for an antidote, right? And so things that we can agree on, common ground and respect, and more debate. And so obviously no one here is going to be against more debate, but there's also a sense in which, I mean, is that really the solution? And I mean, debate is happening all the time, but it's not just about having debates. It's also, about asking sort of prodding questions about, who participates in those debates, who has authority, and also getting a little beyond, debating by problematizing, voice and the privilege of being an academic, the position from which universities speak, and sort of legacies of structural discrimination. So debating, of course, as a fine liberal proposition, but I feel as if just debating won't really get us out of this bind. So I was kind of quite sensitive to Dr. Shaikh's idea that we need to really work upstream. And so there was a mention of governance, also the curriculum. And I'm often struck by how the curriculum is a really important part of this, right? So apart from diversity in faculty recruitment, etc., just for the kind of the obligatory references in the curriculum and how they tend to promote and favor certain voices historically. So I think, there's some universities, I know at UCAM, I see my colleague Alejandro Lorita is here. There's a degree of student involvement in syllabi. I don't know if that extends to, the readings and such things, but there were demands also at McGill for more diversity in reading lists, right? As a strong, signifier of the faculty's commitment to diversity and inclusion. And then finally, just maybe one or two quick thoughts. I mean, one of them is, academic freedom. So there's I think the human rights framework tends to reinforce a sense of academic freedom as an individual right, right? Something which as an academic you have. So what about thinking of academic freedom as a more broadly a kind of collective culture, right? Something that sort of is communal and has to take into account a diversity of interest. And then there's I think a question that we haven't really addressed, which is, so does it really mostly apply to profs? What about students? What about graduate students, you know, who are kind of somewhere in between? And I think that's, you know, maybe an interesting conversation to have.
Great, thanks. Any of the panelists would like to weigh in on Fred's comments?
Yeah, I mean, individual or collective, I would say individual and collective. Most certainly not just individual. You sort of summarized my suggestion with the word debate. I must have misspoken there and not made myself very clear. I was not just talking about debate. I was talking about a grassroots based built up of positions as a community. That is something much more seriously. We as Magna Carta have been doing a couple of trials here. A project we call the Living Values Project with a couple of universities in many different constituencies, and varying from Indian Ocean islands to the Scandinavian countries, Scotland, Brazil. And in these very, very different situations, universities started a 2-year project where they started to reflect on some of the basic values they professed as a university, but never really made their own. It was felt to be something festive and official in terms of proclamation or something part of a code or a law or a rule, but never the real ownership of students and staff and faculty became true. What became true. I mean, the agency was absolutely zero. So that's when you do that, and when you do build it up grassroots wise, that changes. And in that kind of a process, you may not always reach agreement on everything, but at least it is a common property. It is a community kind of place, a square that belongs to all of us, rather than a boardroom. And I mean, my position would be that these things should get out of boardrooms and out of dean's offices into the square of the campus, and it should be becoming owned by the whole of the university and the whole of the academic community. And again, that won't solve things overnight, and it won't lead to agreement on everything. It will be a process that you will have to repeat year after year, but then at least we develop a sense. I compare this to the issue of integrity and ethics in university research. When I was a graduate in the early 70s, everything was tradition and implicit. There were no debates, there was no training, there was never a discussion among PhD candidates, let alone with your professors, on ethical matters. Now, 40 years later, that is absolutely the rule. And we have these debates already in undergraduate classes. We repeat them in graduate classes. We do them among professors. We do them among students. It is a topic that is owned by all of us. And again, we do not always reach agreement, but it is absolutely true. This is part of the property, so to say, of the academic community. And I would like academic freedom and institutional autonomy and social responsibility of universities to reach a comparable status. and be the common property of the academic and student community. That's what I meant. Sorry for not being clear before.
I see that we're coming up on a bit 5 minutes, I think, before the end, if I'm not mistaken, of the panel. So I will just ask Professor Appiagyei-Atua or Dr. Shaikh if they wanted to respond to Professor McGrath's comments.
No, I don't have anything useful to add to what Sijbolt has said.
Thank you. Dr. Shaikh?
Me also.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. So I would just, maybe I'll just add one thought, which is in the North American context, there's a bit of a tension in what's proposed in the idea of the grassroots initiative, as opposed to thinking about things from the perspective of regulating or policy-driven top-down approach. So I think the idea that the common square where these ideas get debated, for some has been presented as an abdication of responsibility on the part of institutional leadership, and that the work of setting parameters down should not be left to a process that is democratic, not because democracy is inherently weak, but because it will suppress minority voices. And so it is therefore incumbent on institutional leadership to take on the responsibility of understanding what the responsibilities are and actually to codify them so that it's very clear. And the do's and don'ts, you know, I think that's completely intuitive from an academic perspective, that the do's and don'ts do not allow for exploration and debate. So that idea of having a set of commandments by which we all march along does not resonate with many members of an academic community. But for people who feel that classroom spaces and research spaces are not safe for them, in some cases, that is exactly what they're looking for, so that there's a very clear set of when the line is crossed and that they don't want to do the work necessarily of debating those things every time. So from my own perspective, I find it really, it's an interesting problem from a juridical perspective for a jurist to think about where and how and when do rules make sense, because it doesn't necessarily harmonize with the perspective of an academic approach to these things. On the other hand, from my own experiences, trying to do that work of really creating spaces to listen to students and other members of a university community who particularly have not always felt welcomed in liberal institutions, there is a real desire for having what they would say a top-down approach is actually what is the responsible things to do in these cases. So it's quite an interesting tension to navigate.
Well, that's always, I mean, if this was easy, it would have been solved. This is walking a very thin line, and yeah. It's always it very much depends on your situation. I mean, next week I have a supervisory board meeting of a university in Russia, in St. Petersburg, where I'm a member of that board. And you can imagine the discussions having a different flavor than when I have these discussions in Italy or in Germany or in the Netherlands. These differences explain some of the different modes of approach. And of course, even when you do this in the Commons, it does not mean that deans and provosts and vice chancellors do not have a leadership responsibility. Right. But that leadership responsibility should be rooted in and defended and accepted in the Commons. And I mean, if I, in the years I was president of the university, would see that these things go out of hand in the sense that minorities do not get the kind of open space and security they need, of course it's your responsibility to provide that and to fight for that. But taking it all into the hands of the leadership and to the realm of rules would be absolutely the opposite of what I think socially will work well. I mean, if the academic community has to make this its own responsibility at the same time as it is the special responsibility of leadership, it has to have the chance to participate and build it up. So it's that fine balance that we have to try to negotiate and make work. That's why it's fun to do it, because it's difficult.
Great. Okay, so I think with that, I'm going to bring it to a close. My understanding is that we end at 45. Is that correct? Yes.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
What we
Thank
can
you so much.
formally close, and then those who can stay could continue to have a little conversation on.
Great.
Yeah, we have the traditional corridor conversation for anyone who wants to linger. So we'll see everyone who wants and can attend tomorrow for our 2 panels. Sharon helpfully put the program in the chat.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.